question is, are we going to rush towards the differences, or are we going to celebrate and relish the similarities? And I am afraid that we live in an environment where we rush toward the division. In some instances, we can't even have a conversation. I mean, no one's ever been yelled or argued into changing his or her position. You might be loved into it, you might be persuaded into it, but you're never humiliated into changing your position. And for my Democrat friends, when I see a poll that says 66% of Democrats don't have a Republican friend, and then I see in that same poll 66% of Republicans don't have a Democrat friend, I think, it's no longer race or socioeconomic, although all of that still exists. Maybe it's politics that is so divisive in our country. I'm lucky. I don't have to go very far to find someone who disagrees with me. I live with a 21-year-old socialist. That would be my daughter, not my wife. I'll be very, very clear about that. My wife looks 21, but she is not 21. That would be our daughter. She has very different views from those of her parents. And you know what? So did I when I was 21 years old. So did I. We don't argue. We don't fight. Life's too precious. I don't want to spend whatever time we have together. I want to hear her out. I want her to hear me out. I want her to listen without prejudice. I want to listen without prejudice. At the end of the day, for the most part, she keeps her beliefs and I keep my beliefs, but there is no fracture in the relationship. And I'm afraid now in our country, in certain pockets, there is a fracturing. We have people being thrown out of restaurants because of who they work for. We have kids being humiliated by adults because they happen to watch one school shooting too many. It just pushed them over the edge. That's not the world they want to grow up in. And you are welcome to have a different view from them. But I don't get ridiculing children. And I don't get throwing people out of restaurants because they happen to have different political beliefs. That's not the country I want to live in, and it used to not be that way. So how do we get back to having a conversation where you are welcome to your belief and I'm welcome to mine, but there's not going to be this divisiveness, this fracturing? If you're waiting on that to happen in Washington, you will have a long, miserable, fruitless wait. So here's my question to myself, and you are welcome to eavesdrop in on this question that I asked myself. It's really not for you. It's more for me. Are you a believer who happens to be engaged in the political process? Or are you a Republican or a Democrat who happens to attend church? Let me say that again. Are you a believer who happens to think it's important to engage in the civic process? Or are you a Republican or a Democrat who thinks you ought to attend church? What is your identity? When you hear the phrase, "we the people," do you think people means the people in our country's foundational document? Because you'll see the phrase there, "we the people." Or when you hear people, do you think to the Old Testament where it says, "if my people"? So what's our identity? Because if you are looking for healing to come to this country, it will start with believers, because unity is biblical. It was not me or anyone else in politics who said, in Christ there is no Jew, no Gentile, no male, no female. And I'll bet you if he were here, he would say no black, no white, no brown, no Republican, no independent, no Democrat, no libertarian. Who do you identify with, and how do you identify yourself? So unity is biblical. It's also practical. A house divided against itself cannot stand. How do you know that? Because you've heard that phrase your entire life. How does something become an idiom? Because it's true. A house divided against itself cannot stand. So if you primarily identify as a believer, if you say, look, my view of government is important to me, but I primarily identify with my spiritual beliefs, then I want you to know it's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. You serve a God who has called you to love your enemies, to pray for those who persecute you. If someone asks for a shirt, give them a cloak too. And who said, blessed are the peacemakers. There was a British, I guess he's a Renaissance man of sorts, partly political scientist, partly theologian, a guy named G.K. Chesterton. He said, it is not that Christianity has been tried and found wanting or lacking or insufficient. It is that Christianity is really hard. Therefore, it is rarely tried. It is not that Christianity has been found wanting, insufficient, lacking. It is that it is really hard. And therefore, it is rarely tried. If Tim Scott were here this morning, he would tell you the moment he knew that our relationship was different was the night a young person walked into a church in Charleston, South Carolina, and killed 9 believers because they happened to be black. Imagine that. Imagine gathering on a weekday night to learn more about God, to study His Word. And in walks a stranger. You welcome that stranger. You give him a seat. You pray with that stranger and you pray for that stranger. And at the end of that prayer time, that stranger who had driven over 100 miles, passing mile marker after mile marker after mile marker, knowing full well what he was going to do. The rage that I felt, initially at God, we'll be honest with you, initially at God. And before anyone says that's sacrilegious, I would refer you to the book in the Old Testament titled Habakkuk, where he asked God a lot of tough questions. Trust me, God's got the answers. It's okay to ask the questions. How could you let this happen? 9 people who are doing nothing except what you asked them to do, what you told them to do, and they welcome in a stranger. And this is what happens. And it wasn't 48 hours after one of the most horrific things to ever happen, not just in my state, but in my country. And the family members of those 9 who were slain, those 9 fellow believers who were slain solely because of the color of their skin. Family member after family member after family member stood up, looked at the defendant, and said, "We forgive you." I couldn't do it. I confess I could not do it. Christianity is hard. It's hard. The path of least resistance is the political path. The hard part is if you identify as a believer, following the teachings and the admonitions of Christ. So what do you need to have unity? You got to have the barriers come down. Whatever real or perceived barriers you think exist, Christ knocked every one of them down. Gender barriers, not just the woman at the well. Who were the first people to appreciate the deity of Christ? Women. Who were the last to leave him at the cross? Women. Who were the first to really believe he'd been resurrected? Women. He broke down gender barriers. He broke down racial barriers. Anybody familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan? That's not about a rich guy leaving some money for a guy that was injured. That's the breaking of religious barriers. Socioeconomic barriers. If Jesus had anything nice to say about rich people, I have missed it. I cannot find it.